Good evening and welcome to the 134th Annual Henry George Dinner. I'd like to begin tonight's gathering by mispronouncing and acknowledging the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. They are the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to welcome two special guests tonight. I think we have Carl Williams. Is Carl here? Not yet. Carl's not here. Okay. Carl was the 1995 keynote speaker, and he's a former treasurer of Prosper Australia. We also are honored to have Tim Costello here, who was a 1996 speaker. Tim, right there. I won't make you stand up. All of you, I think, would know Tim from his work as the CEO of World Vision, and he's also very active today in other organizations, such as serving as an executive director of Mike Australia. Please join me in welcoming Tim. My name is Joe Langley. I'm the secretary of Prosper's Executive Committee, and it's my pleasure to serve as the MC tonight. Australian Georgists have come together annually for 134 years now on nights like this to celebrate Henry George's ideas, writings, and life. Over these years, Georgists have listened to a wide range of outstanding civic leaders, tax reformists, community advocates, to speak about how we can make our society here more prosperous and more equitable for all. Tonight will be no different, but I'm guessing that few of you know about Henry George's interest in railroads. In an article he wrote in the San Francisco Examiner in 1868, George worried about the potential social disparities and inequities resulting from the introduction of railroads in California. Imagine that. We've got the same issue here with the Southern Suburban Rail Loop, the Sydney Metro, and high-speed rail, which is one of my favorite topics. Having seen cities across the globe in his travels, George worried that the Transcontinental Railroad would create the same imbalances of poverty and wealth that existed in San Francisco, which is where he lived, that he'd seen in New York, London, Paris, and Delhi. George was well justified in his concern, as we can see with today's methods that the federal and state governments are using to fund social and affordable housing, transport, and other essential infrastructure in Australia. And Australia has a front row seat on how this can play out if we don't make fundamental changes to the tax policies that we currently use. All you have to do is look north to the United States. Despite having the world's highest GDP, the most billionaires, and the best educational and medical services in the world, the U.S. generally finishes at the bottom of the developed economies in social and economic measures. For example, the U.S. measures 34th out of 38 countries on life expectancy, 33rd out of 38 countries on infant mortality. It's at the worst, at the bottom end of the scale on income inequities, and it generally underperforms all other countries on a broad range of health and medical measures. As we dine tonight, people across the United States are preparing for armed troops to enter their cities against the objections of state and local elected officials. Economic disparity is a slippery slope, and it has dire consequences. So you might ask what all that has to do with railroads. Well, each of the projects that I mentioned earlier is at some stage of development now in Australia. These are important and necessary public improvements, but the funding method used are transferring wealth from public to private hands and accelerating the income disparities that Henry George warned us about. They're hoovering up our common wealth and suffocating critical funding for other programs. Tonight's keynote speaker, John Alexander, has been a leading national voice on the need for more effective policies and programs to address these problems. And he'll deliver his keynote speech a little bit later in the evening. In terms of the formalities, we'll have our entrees. They're being served now. I'm going to turn over to Tim Godwin, who's our president, and he will deliver the E.J. Craigie Award, which is given to the best Georgist article of the year. We'll then have dinner, and I'll come back to introduce John to deliver his keynote address.
Good evening and a very warm welcome. As Joe mentioned earlier, we've mixed up the schedule of the dinner this evening, and I'm going to announce the winner of the E.J. Craigie Award for the best piece of Georgist writing in the preceding 12 months. My name's Matt Godwin, and I have the privilege of holding the role of President of Prosper this year, following some years on the Executive Committee. I'd first like to acknowledge the contribution of Catherine Cashmore, who held the role for almost a decade, I think. Catherine remains a valued member of the Executive Committee, and her ability to prosecute the Georgist argument is second to none. Also acknowledge Carl Williams here tonight as well, former Treasurer, who did a lot of excellent work for Prosper over the years. The day-to-day work, the hard yards in Prosper, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Raina Fahey and Tim Helm. They really are very skilled operators and passionate proponents of Georgist understanding, and Prosper, we're very fortunate to have you. A popular Georgist reference is seeing the cat, which you might be familiar with. That's the classic drawing of the tree where the branches and the leaves define the outline of the cat. It's not immediately obvious at first when you look at the drawing. It may be to some, but for most it's not. But when you see it, you can't unsee it. And so it is with Georgism and our insight into the fundamental dynamics of our economic system, which remains obscured to many people. I'm sure most of you here tonight share my frustration with that, as well as really astonishment, to be honest, and a bit baffled by how so many in the media fail to grasp what's happening and explain it clearly. So a key goal for Prosper, for our strategy we developed at the start of the year leading into 2028, is to translate our understanding and our advocacy into public policy recommendations so that people can see what's possible. They can see what a system looks like that's outside, that sits above the typical left-right political dichotomy that most people understand, the limiting sort of understanding of that. And the media has a critical role to play in this, in reporting, in dissecting, in challenging the narratives in public discourse. Prosper created the E.J. Craigie Award in 2014 to acknowledge and celebrate those who contribute to Australia's economic debate, who advocate for reform, who contest poor policy, with commentary propagating Georgist understanding. It's a long road, this journey we're on. We know this more than most. Prosper's Australia's oldest economic organisation, dating back to the 1890s. Raising public awareness and increasing understanding of Georgism is essential in our campaign for a fair and just economic system. Not just for the hearts and minds, but for building support that translates into real public policy. Joe Langley, John Alexander here tonight, are speaking tonight on value capture, a powerful and important step on this journey, shining a light squarely on the role of economic rent, indeed the presence of which is still poorly understood, and helping a critical mass of people see the cat. It was only a few weeks ago I saw that term suddenly economic rent, which usually only the Georgists really know what that means. And unfortunately, it was being used completely out of context to describe profitable companies. So another moment of frustration there, and really just brought home to me the role that the media needs to play in understanding what they're reporting on and prosecuting it clearly. And the economic rent and the role that it plays is central to a lot of the ills that we find in our society today. And addressing that has to be part of the solution. There is no other way. So it's my great pleasure to announce the winner of the 2025 E.J. Craigie Award is Ross Gittins for his article, The Productivity Commission Wants Our Big Mining Companies to Pay More Rent. Ross says that he's very grateful to have been awarded the E.J. Craigie Writing Award. He believes in the adequate taxation of economic rent to be vitally important to our society. And this really follows some research that Prosper put out in November 2024 by Tim Helm, Research Director, and Cameron Murray in our report called Rent Controlled Royalties. Why are we undercharging Australian mining tenants? And it's, I don't like to, but my observation is it's borderline treasonous how much of our natural resource wealth this country has just given away, with the profits generally being pocketed by not just companies but foreign companies as well. So, there's an aspect of economic rent that desperately needs to be addressed. So congratulations to Ross. He's not here tonight, but Ross is a big supporter of Georgism, and we value his work. With that, I'll let you get back to your dinner. Joe and John will be with you soon for the main event, and by all means, please say hi afterwards. If I'm not up here, I'll be downstairs for a post-dinner drink. Thanks very much.
It's my pleasure to introduce John Alexander to you tonight. John, as you know, is or was a member of the House of Representatives from 2010 to 2022, during which time he led a number of key parliamentary committees. He was chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Infrastructure, Transport, and Cities, which is where I got to know him. He was chair of the Committee on Economics, the Committee on Tax and Revenue, and the Coalition Policy Committee on Infrastructure and Regional Development. He led the Liberal Party's Sustainable Cities Policy Task Force and the Parliamentary Friends of Rail Group, which invites members of the industry in to provide presentations and information to the members of Parliament. He also was a huge supporter of mine and a founding director of the Australian High-Speed Rail Association, and we've got some members at the back here. He's been fantastic in opening doors and helping us. But the thing that he has done is create a body of work in Parliament that is pretty well hidden, but is incredibly important to Australia's future long-term development if it's ever taken up. He's a strong supporter of federal and state government policies that implement value capture funding on transport projects and promote regional development and are designed to improve social and affordable housing supply. I think I don't have to tell people in a bar or a club like this in Melbourne that he played a bit of tennis in his youth. He was a professional tennis player, as I'm sure you all know, but that went from the 1960s into the mid-1980s. During which time he led the Australian team to the Davis Cup victory in Sydney. On a personal note, we've the journey I think that John and I have taken started about the same time in Atlanta, Georgia, when we were 17, 18 years of age, and he moved to Atlanta from Australia to play tennis and become a tennis pro and become a superstar. And I moved from Southeast Asia to Atlanta when my father got out of the military, and I did none of the things that he did. But we both saw in Atlanta the city grow during a period of about 20 years from 1 million people to 6 million people today. From 1980 to about 1990, the growth rate in the Sydney metropolitan area was at 5% per year. It was incredible growth. And during that period of time, there was a huge investment in infrastructure, mainly, unfortunately, roads, but also all sorts of other infrastructure. They actually did build a metro line, created the largest airport, the busiest airport in the world. And I think in the talks that John and I have had over the years, Atlanta sort of lit a bit of a light in our brains that we came back together again in about 2014, I think it was, John, when I was sitting at my desk at ACOM and the phone rang, and it was John, but I didn't know who he was at the time. And he started asking me about value capture and what I was doing in that particular field. And I got to know him pretty well, and he said, would you come down to Canberra and talk about your experiences there? And it was a night that Tony Abbott almost lost his seat. But that particular night was when he was being presented some of the work that John had done on value capture. And all that work was about funding infrastructure and going to public transport and supporting affordable housing. And Tony got up and he said, I'm so pleased to see that John has found another way for us to fund roads. So the work continues. But now I'd like to invite John Alexander to come up and share with us all the tremendous work he's done at the federal level for affordable housing, transport, and other social programs. John Alexander.
Thank you, Joe. That was a long introduction. And I often tell a story, and I was asked to introduce Julie Bishop one night in Canberra during a major event. And I started telling a story about playing tennis at the Alan King Classic in Las Vegas, which was a very desirable tournament to play. You got to go to all the shows. And I reflected that as you went to the lesser lights, the introductions were magnificent. But when we went to see Frank Sinatra, there was no introduction at all. He just walked onto the stage. So I was telling the stage, and then I said, please welcome, and Julia walked on. And I thought that was sort of cute. But thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I hope you won't be disappointed. But at least what I want is to engage and continue a conversation and maybe stimulate that a little bit more and challenge. I've got to say it's been such a joy to sit with Tim Costello. I'm a bit of a fan of yours, but I contain my my fandom for the moment, and it's great talking with you tonight. And the other person who impressed so much was Anne-Marie Hermans. What a treasure you are. What are you, an asset you are to the Victorian government. So good luck with you and your future career. You'll do great things, I'm sure. But tonight I'm going to try to connect the various inquiries that I was involved in, from sustainable cities to home ownership, to the planning of settlement, to the funding of infrastructure and the role that infrastructure must play in facilitating settlement, to address some of our big problems, which is the over-congestion of our major cities. An extraordinary fact, we have incredible amounts of immigration at the moment, and when I did my inquiry on this subject, I think it was 85% of immigrants went into Sydney and Melbourne, compounding the problem of overpriced and overcrowded cities. So I've got some written notes which I'll stick to for a while. I will drift off. Joe, tell me if I've drifted off too far, and then we'll open up to discussion, hopefully. So I gave a name to my speech tonight, which is dangerous, and it's from Commonwealth to Kingdom to Revolution. I did an interview recently, and I was talking about Commonwealth, and I'm trying to explain to my interviewer that Commonwealth actually means commonwealth, that wealth was common. And certainly when I was growing up in the 50s and the 60s, wealth was common. But it's becoming less so. We've got the lowest rate of home ownership in 60 years, and that used to be the barometer of our wealth, was the rate of home ownership. And from the end of the Second World War until sometime in the 70s, we went from under 40% over 70% of home ownership, and that was the barometer of how well our country was doing. And Tim, you're almost my age, aren't you? I'm just tall for my age. I'm not that old. The other criteria was the minimum wage and the cost of a beer were the three big things. But anyway, the way I see it is that the greatest domestic threat to our Commonwealth is the growing division of wealth. And I intend to be provocative by claiming that we are on a trajectory from Commonwealth, literally Commonwealth, to a kingdom state, and then on to revolution. Tonight I want to raise an awareness of the deep consequences of negative gearing and the all-pervasive role it plays in the concentration of wealth and the issue of value capture, or what we have at the moment is called value escape. In Parliament, we backbenchers were often given a bit of time. We were permitted to speak freely on a topic of our choice. It's called an adjournment debate, which is late on a Thursday night at the end of a sitting week, when hopefully our superiors would think nobody would be listening. But I'll just read a little bit of one of my adjournment debates that I've kept. The writing is small, but I think I can still read it without glasses, maybe. And it was Kingdom to Commonwealth, but it went like this. It was meant to be a little bit funny, so laugh. If you don't laugh, it's a poor reflection on your IQ. I tried that line once in Brisbane, and half the crowd laughed and half didn't. But anyway, since 1707, the Kingdom of Britain has transitioned to the British Commonwealth, where even the commoner can own land, once the province only of lords. The British lords accumulated enormous wealth on the toil of their serf tenants. It was even better to be king. The British Empire grew to the far reaches of the planet, and colonial rule reigned supreme. Far from the land of kings, queens and lords, Australia, the lucky country, boomed under the banner of Commonwealth of Australia. And we lived the dream that allowed home ownership to a higher percentage of our population than any other country. A man's home was his castle, a real opportunity for every Australian family. Something has changed now. The empowerment of many has been taken by new lords who share many benefits of the lords of old England. These lords are known as landlords, and somehow consecutive governments have empowered these lords to rule the working class, taking from them any chance of home ownership and enslaving them to effect the enrichment of their lords, their landlords. This is not a joke, and it's not funny. The current tax laws allow the investor, the landlord, to borrow 100% of the purchase price and deduct the cost not only against the income of the property, but also against their other income. That's negative gearing. The investor is also allowed to deduct all other costs of the property, from council rates to power to electricity to water to even having the dog walked or the lawn mowed. On the other hand, the owner-occupier must pay their mortgage with after-tax dollars and has no deductions. How does this play out with interest rates at a historic low and rents high? And I must say I attended a number of auctions with children and friends who had children who were looking. And at one event, the daughter of my partner lost out in a very closely contested auction. And the man who won the auction turned to me and said, your daughter seems to like this property. Do you think she'd be interested in renting it? I was begging him to ask her because she would have smashed him. And he deserved to be. The attitude was unbelievable. And that's what happens time and again, and it is the renter that is imprisoned like a serf tenant of old to the gaining of greater wealth by the landlord. In talking just briefly about the last federal election, many would agree that what disappointed most about the last federal election was the lack of vision. Did we hear any great ideas, any vision for a young, vibrant, rich in so many ways country? Where were our leaders tapping into our collective imagination to divine a vision for our future? A contest of ideas and vision to fulfil our potential, it was not. What are the consequences if we continue on the path we're on? Our major cities are over-congested, overpriced, and undersupply of housing with immigration at records level. A recipe to increase these existing challenges, all while our regions are left behind. Our political culture has failed us. High-speed rail has been debated for over 40 years, and Australia has spent more on inquiries into high-speed rail than any other country. It's not that funny, over 140 million of your dollars. Laugh not. And I've contributed to that. I'm so sorry, because I did 3 inquiries into this subject: harnessing value and delivering infrastructure, building up and moving out, which was the building up, densifying around infrastructure hubs in our major cities, but more importantly, strategic decentralisation, moving out. And the final one on the subject was fairer funding and financing of faster rail, and I'll talk about each of those. In short, harnessing value and delivering infrastructure explored the opportunity of value capture, funding of high-speed rail, and the term value escape came into being because we were not value capturing. Our recommendations were simply, when infrastructure and zoning creates windfall uplift in property values, that the unearned beneficiary should contribute proportionately. Building up and moving out went further to explore concerns that saw 85% of immigrants settling into either Sydney or Melbourne, adding fuel to the fire that was already very hard to control. The retrofitting of infrastructure into these cities is very expensive and rarely meets the current needs, let alone future needs. What was represented as planning was in fact a reaction to a problem that had developed because of a lack of planning. Therefore, our needs were clearly defined. We needed to be proactive, not reactive. And this thinking came from a presentation of a town planner at Epping, which was in the heart of my electorate, a guy called Steve McMahon, and he was a great presenter, and I was really caught up, and he was talking about the plans of Epping. And I went up to him after. I thought he had a sense of humour, and I said, that's not a plan, Steve. He says, oh no, that's the plan. I said, no, it's not a plan. I said, what you've presented is a solution to a problem that has developed because there has been no planning. And he gave me his card and he said, please call me. And he started my education in that area. And thank you, Steve. He was fantastic. But he agreed with me, which is a dangerous thing. And that was the foundation of that thinking, that we've never planned our settlement. How can you have a country and not think to plan settlement? And so without a plan, we've had this concentration of population into these major cities, and our regions have died. A summation of this inquiry recommended that there should be a master planner of settlement, a master plan for infrastructure to support the plan of settlement, and a master funding mechanism through value capture. Fairer funding and faster rail inquiry was called out of concerns of what was in train if the development of was in train at the Western Sydney Airport where the landholders and speculators were making out like bandits, funded by the taxpayer investment into that infrastructure that elevated unearned beneficiaries to unprecedented levels. And the uplift of the value of that land was extraordinary. And if high-speed rail ever proceeded, this gross inequity would be repeated time and again. It's important to understand the challenges we face in Australia that have resulted in a failure to plan and develop policies at all levels of government for way too long. In the absence of a plan of settlement, an imbalance has evolved that sees our major cities overcrowded, overpriced and overcongested while our regions have been in decline. We have a housing shortage, yet we have record levels of immigration. Housing affordability in Sydney is second highest in the world, only to Hong Kong. Compounding the concentration of wealth that negative gearing provides for landlords, their close cousins, the speculator and landowners, are participating in what many would claim to be an even greater concentration of wealth funded by the taxpayer. Wealth is being concentrated and no longer common. In the Parliamentary Inquiry of Fairer Funding and Financing of Faster Rail, evidence identified another inequity, whereby in the absence of a value capture mechanism being applied in the surrounding areas of the development of the Western Sydney Airport, the most obscene transference of wealth from taxpayer to landowners and speculators occurred in Australia's history. In short, the taxpayer funded the infrastructure of the airport, the rail lines, the roads and the services, and coupled with rezoning, increased land values most extraordinarily. One notable speculator who's doing time for the murder of a business partner bought some land for $3 million and sold it for $500 million. Ron Medich. Other lands that was previously dairy farmland and valued at about $2,000 an acre, when you put a metro station on that land and zone around it for high density 20-storey buildings, what do you think that acre is then worth? I can tell you it's upward of $10 million. That's an increase of 5,000 times. No one ever gets that question right, by the way, so. And very few people know what value capture is. I could have asked you right at the beginning, who knows what value capture is, but hopefully by the end of this you will know. But the concerns that if we go ahead and build high-speed rail, that scenario will play out time and again. The claim that government was investing taxpayers' money was disingenuous, as the benefit did not find its way back to the taxpayer in any way but went directly to the landowners and the speculators, gambling on their knowledge, often inside knowledge. Why this inquiry was called was out of fear that if ever we went forward with high-speed rail, this scenario would be repeated time and again, with even greater wealth for the few funded by the many. This pattern of inequity, driven by policy gaps, has not only deepened the divide between urban and regional Australia, but has also created a vicious cycle of opportunity and disadvantage. The concentration of resources, jobs, infrastructure in metropolitan areas act as a magnet, pulling more people in and further overwhelming an already strained system. Meanwhile, regional communities, once thriving centres of innovation and industry, are left to contend with dwindling populations, underinvestment and a sense of neglect. A strategic plan for national settlement is a fundamental foundation stone. In regard to funding infrastructure, we had evidence from Tim Williams from London's Cross-City Rail project. And he had often been lauded for raising some 30% of the cost of the Cross-City Rail through a betterment tax. And his opening statement went something like, I'm embarrassed at being lauded for the success of this betterment levy that funded a third of the cost of the project. And that I really had stuffed up because if we'd shared in the resulting uplift of the property values, the entire cost of the project would have been met. So he was a strong advocate for value capture. The notion that value capture could at best only fund a third of infrastructure cost was repeated because of this initial claim that a very successful levy had only paid for a third. But that's simply not correct. Laser focused on our challenge of funding high-speed rail in Australia, we had extraordinary evidence from a Professor Andrew McNaughton of UK's high-speed rail too. He encapsulated his position by saying that the uplift of property values around metro stations were very significant in the immediate vicinity. He went on to say that the uplift was much more dramatic and over a larger region around a regional station. Then concluded, however, that the most significant uplift occurs around a high-speed rail station over a greater area and a longer period of time. Value escape had become a common terminology to describe what had happened in Australia over the last 100 years, climaxing now at Badgerys Creek and the development of the Western Sydney Airport. Our building up and moving out inquiry made fundamental recommendations for the master planning of settlement, the master planning of infrastructure, and the master plan of funding through value capture. Of the 3 parliamentary inquiries that I initiated and chaired, there was never one dissenting report. That means there was unanimous bipartisan support for the findings and recommendations. Important conclusions were reached in the understanding of the purpose of high-speed rail, how it will contribute to addressing some of our most intractable challenges, and most importantly, how it should be funded. One of the early and somewhat surprising learnings was that high-speed rail's main reason for being was not as an alternative to air travel between our major cities, Sydney and Melbourne, even though that is the second busiest air corridor in the world, but more importantly to provide commutable times into our major cities from satellite cities, therefore creating world-competitive mega regions. This understanding led us on a path of other collateral benefits of dramatically increasing affordable housing supply. This, no doubt, would benefit if our housing sector could be returned to one of shelter, not a speculative, volatile, get-rich sector for the investor. A land of lords and serf tenants, a kingdom, not a commonwealth. When Philip Lowe, the former governor of the Reserve Bank, was asked what was needed to facilitate major infrastructure, his response was that if 40 years ago I had told you that my board and I would set the prime rate of interest at arm's length from government, people would have laughed. But it's worked very well. And he suggested that short of bipartisanship, this is what is required. And I would think that that is probably the case, because we've seen recently one of the most embarrassing things in our recent history was that the referendum to recognise our Indigenous people as the first people of this land couldn't get up. There is not a snowflake's chance in hell that if you leave it in the government's hands, that high-speed rail will get up. They cannot agree on anything. The whole system of political debate is non-productive. And the first casualty in virtually any political debate or campaign are the facts. I was fascinated recently, there was 2 smartest men in the world, the 2 men with the highest IQ, which I think come in 4, 5 and 6 behind the smartest 3 women. So, they both agreed when asked what was their God, they said the truth and the facts. And you reflect then, well, what is our government culture like? Because it is so devoid of the facts and manipulating facts and devoid of the truth. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Unfortunately, the plan announced to commence this nation's building of infrastructure, the high-speed rail, has gone diametrically opposed to all of the recommendations of the 3 inquiries that I chaired. So we finally have a high-speed rail authority, and they're going to commence high-speed rail in Australia with a station at Central. It's going to go to Gosford, and when it gets there, it's about 6 levels down, and then to Broadmeadows in Newcastle. The fundamental findings of our inquiries was that you had to identify greenfield sites where you could maximise the uplift of the value of properties to fund the cost of infrastructure, of this infrastructure. So we have this absurd situation where we're going to go through the most challenging geography in Australia, under the harbour, from Central. What's the chances of getting some uplift at Central in property values? Give me a break, like, hello. And then under the Hawkesbury River, where it's so deep, they've got 500 million to spend. They've been spending the money, and they've put these pylons down a couple of 100 metres trying to find where they can finally get the tunnel to be dug under the Hawkesbury River. By the time it gets to Gosford, it's about 6 or 7 levels down. The cost of that station will be phenomenal. Gosford is blocked by water on one side and hills on the other. There's no room to create a 1 million people city. You go about 20 k's north and you've got an area west of Arimba where you could have an enormous city, halfway between Sydney and Newcastle. And then Broadmeadows, I talked to the mayor just a couple of weeks ago. Oh, they've got 20,000 homes that can be built at Broadmeadow. 20,000 homes, give me a break. There's an area between Newcastle and Maitland where you can establish 1 million homes. Now we're talking, but that's not happening. So it's extraordinary that Anthony Albanese, who is a fan of high-speed rail, can put in place an authority and then ignore the 3 inquiries that his members of his government participated in and did not object to one single issue, and yet ignore those, part of the $140 million that we've spent was just wasted. And it is such a pity and so frustrating to be in government. The first words that I was greeted with when I went into Parliament was Tony Abbott talking about a meritocracy, and I said, "Oh yeah, I understand what a meritocracy is. I used to play prize money tennis, and if you win the match, you get the money, and if you don't, you don't. That's a meritocracy." I thought it was a very funny look. He was always struggling to find his humour. The corridor between Sydney and Melbourne links 2 of the highest cost housing cities in the world, separated by several regional cities, surrounded by greenfield sites, producing the most ideal precondition to maximise value capture funding. Australia recently suffered, as I was just talking about, an international embarrassment by failing a referendum to recognise our Indigenous people as our first people. Political warfare fails us time and time again. It's an embarrassment. For high-speed rail to become a reality, there must be either a bipartisan support or take Philip Lowe's advice and install an independent body similar in nature to the Reserve Bank to deliver major infrastructure. So what to do about housing? Shh, don't mention negative gearing, because that's political suicide. Could you imagine during the whole last election, when housing is such an issue, and negative gearing wasn't mentioned by either party? After my inquiry into home ownership and further discussions with Glenn Stevens, who was the Governor of the Reserve Bank, John Fraser, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Wayne Byers from APRA, and we, through our inquiries, became quite good friends and had these strange alignments and enthusiasm for developing a suite of policies, which we went ahead and did. And I'd just like to share some with you to commence that conversation. And I'll start off with a couple of comments that further clarified my thinking on housing and wealth distribution. One was by Hank Paulson, the American who was charged with addressing the global financial crisis under Barack Obama. By the way, I met Barack Obama and I was introduced to a tennis player, and he said tennis was his first love. And he said, I was ranked in Hawaii as a 12 and under, and then our family moved and I had to give up tennis. I started playing basketball. So I looked at him, I said, so had I quit tennis at 12, I could have been the President of the United States. He had his doubts about me for a while. So there was a gathering 10 years after the global financial crisis and a reunion with the major players, Ben Bernanke, Timothy Geithner and others. In a tight little huddle of the inner circle, Hank confided to his belief that the genesis of the global financial crisis was that in the US, when the housing sector moved from one of shelter to an investment sector. Should we be concerned as to how long our housing sector has been an investment sector, and with the accompanying volatility to the point that this is now our biggest economic sector, and our housing sector, which is our biggest economic sector, is often referred to as a Ponzi scheme. And if you reflect on that, what a Ponzi scheme is, what the components of a Ponzi scheme is, the glove fits. The other comment that I'll raise is one that came from Gore Vidal during a fascinating series of debates with William F. Buckley to the lead up to the US elections in the 60s. Now, this probably predates nearly everybody in this room, but these were two social commentators. One was of the left, one was of the right, and they were both unbelievably obnoxious characters. William F. Buckley probably gets the gold, and Gore Vidal, who was also a famous author, as decent a man as he was pretty arrogant, but they made for great entertainment. But at one point, Gore lamented the concentration of wealth in the US with the extraordinary claim that 25% of the US wealth was held by the wealthiest 5%. Just think about that. 25% of all the wealth was held by 5%. This is in 1962. And that the poorest 25% only held 5% of the nation's wealth. He was outraged, and to the best of my memory, William F. did not oppose Gore's outrage and claims of inequity. And you just have to wonder, what would they think now about their country, where maybe less than 2%, it's claimed, hold the assets of more than 90% of that country. Remember, we have the lowest rate of home ownership in this country at this moment for the last 60 years. Where are we going? What is our trajectory? Are we going from a commonwealth to a country dominated by landlords and real estate speculators, funded and fueled by tax systems and taxpayer-funded infrastructure that concentrates wealth further between those two groups of landlords and speculators? The suite of policies developed were categorised as counterbalancing and stabilising mechanisms. Like the creed of doctors, the first rule was to do no harm, with the aim over time of moving incrementally housing back to a sector of shelter, where the prices would be determined by wage earner competing with wage earner. The first target was addressing investor-driven inflation, and the recommendation was to install a lever to set the percentage of deductibility for investors entering the market, similar in concept to how the Reserve Bank controls inflation through the review and setting of the prime interest rates on a monthly basis. To assist the homebuyer, a policy of accessing super was developed. And I guess that a number of people in this room would be immediately opposed to that notion. Malcolm Turnbull had shot down this idea by saying it was the stupidest idea he'd ever heard, and I'd sought a meeting with him about these issues. And I said, look, I'll raise this issue first, because if you still hold this opinion at the end of that, we can have a cup of tea and I'll be gone, I'll be out of your hair. And so I presented this policy. I made the point that the strongest statistical link to poverty in retirement is not owning your own home. Also considered and often referred to at that time in Parliament as the elephant in the room was our future exposure to increasing aged population and their aged pension entitlements with a reduced percentage of working people to fund such. It was an enormous issue of endless discussion, telling us what the problem was but not coming up with the answer. The policy that I put forward varied in that the money was not taken out of super but transferred into the home purchase through a super mortgage, where the principal component of the mortgage could be funded or part funded from super. The house would then be categorised as a super asset and therefore accessible in regard to the aged pension eligibility. So you're killing two birds with one stone. The question of the house not being a liquid asset was then raised by Malcolm. I think I've got you on this one, though. He'd accepted the argument at this point. But the invention of a product called the super line of credit, whereby agreed amounts could be withdrawn in retirement from the equity in the home. Other policies for essential and key workers and accessing housing in their communities were also developed, and I'm happy to discuss those too. But maybe it's a good time to enter discussion and questions and comments on what I've presented. And I'm very happy to be challenged. I'm very happy to be told that my ideas are no good. But I will suggest this, that if you're going to do that, you need to come with a better idea. That criticism alone has no place in an arena of contest of ideas. So I thank you very much for listening to me. These are my favourite topics to discuss. I bored the hell out of Joe on the way down yesterday. I had him as a captive audience. We discussed these things long and hard. So I look forward to comments, to questions, if I can clarify things, if I can talk about key and workers and essential workers and how we plan to give them part ownership and access to housing. Yes, a young man has his hand in the air.
I wonder actually, John, early in your speech you were talking about basically people being wealthy. You're making that equivalent to people owning a home. What about Germany, Switzerland? 50% of people own homes there versus renting, and these aren't poor countries. What if we were going to change the taxes more to land tax, heavier capital gains, so that even wealthy people might rent? Is there a problem with that?
We've got a lot of history to unwind if we wanted to move to something like that. And there are countries where housing prices remain very stable. It's not an investment sector. And people and renters have far better rights in these countries, and it's fine to rent. I've got a son-in-law who's French, and with his culture, it wasn't important for him to buy a house and own a house, because in France, you can't pass your house on to your family. And housing prices are very, very stable. There's all sorts of taxes to pay if you want to do that. And so he concentrated with his wife to build a great business, and they missed the boat on buying a house. And with the house prices going up and up and up and up, they are further and further and further away as they rent at high prices. The business is going great, but it's not catching up with the rate of housing inflation. And so for us to sort of unwind everything and try to move to that system would be a difficult ask. But to modify it by being able to curb the wings of the investor through having a lever that controls the percentage of deductibility, to get them to control the investor-driven inflation component of housing prices, and then so we don't crash the market like the Bill Shorten policy of negative gearing would have, where you could only negatively gear a new property. Well, that's great, but who do you sell it to? It falls flat on its face at its first hurdle. So I think our method that I think worked so very well of being able to spread wealth through home ownership was the envy of lots and lots of countries, and it gave individuals and families security of tenure and ownership and pride of ownership and investment in their community. There was all sorts of collateral benefits to that. So I think it is a little bit like the development of a Porsche 911. When it was brought out in 1964, I'm a car nut. You couldn't get it registered in Germany because it was unstable, so they put some lead weights in the front bumper bar. But they modified that car and modified as bad a fundamental design as it was with the engine out the back, and they raced it, and every time a component broke, they put in a better component, and it's been the most successful car, in the sports car, racing car in the history of cars. And I think I sort of appreciate that culture, and we've got a product that didn't have the engine right out the back. I think home ownership is a good fundamental, but it needs a little bit of tweaking, constant reviewing and adjustment. And we've gone into where housing is an investment sector with all of the volatility and all of the inflation that's driven when the market is hot, taking people out of the market. Inevitably, it will crash and there will be a lot of people hurt. And what happens when it crashes, trust me, the strong get stronger and the poor miss out. And there'll be even a greater concentration of wealth. Yes?
We just want to wait for the microphone, and Raina will hand it to you. So ask a question, but wait for the microphone.
So just on that last point with, you were saying using super to buy property. I'm not from an economist background nor a political background, so excuse my laymansness. My understanding that wasn't a good thing because essentially it took it out of the super, and the super could accrue the money over the time and then just does like what any first home buyer grant does, inflate the price by how much you do it. So am I right that the point was rather than take it out of the super essentially holds it kind of... explain it to me like I'm 5, essentially is the question. Yeah.
Okay, little girl. Yes. The idea is, as I explained to Malcolm as a 5-year-old, that instead of the money going out of super and going into a house, which would have all sorts of dangers, the contribution of the principal component from your super in the form, I thought I dreamt up a really good name, super mortgage, that then the house would be considered an asset of super. And whether there should be some restrictions, if you can imagine someone's on $100,000 a year, and so there's something like 12% put into their super each year, so say $12,000, and they're buying call it $1 million place, and that means they could put $12,000 a year from their super, up to $12,000 a year, into the interest component of their home. Now, whether you've got to fine-tune this and have certain limits, but as a counterbalance to when you're taking the investor out of the market, which would have a downward pressure, this would be there as a counterbalancing mechanism to stop the market from crashing and just maintaining. But a super investment, housing has been going up at the most ridiculous rate for decades and decades and decades. My parents' first house was £265, which is a little over $500, and it's now worth $2 million. The house isn't worth any more, but the money's worth a whole lot less, but another story. But it is a very, very good investment to invest in housing. It shouldn't have been that good, and it shouldn't be that good in the future. But if you have a lever that can control the percentage of deductibility, and therefore you can reliably deliver to the housing market a preset inflation rate like we have between 2 and 3% when you control the percentage of the prime rate, that should be able to be achieved in housing. So your super invested in your house is going to actually almost guarantee, you can guarantee that it will return whatever the prescribed rate of housing inflation is then going to be achieved by the combination of the lever, the amount of money that you're going to release from super into the market for people to buy their homes. One of the other stabilising policies was that we should have longer term mortgages. In the US, and it was surprising how few of my colleagues understood that in the US you get 30-year mortgages and they are fixed rate. So when the government puts up the rate, it doesn't change. And the other thing is the interest component of their mortgage is tax deductible on your private home. The rules on investing in the US, you can only deduct your costs against the rental income of that property. Why don't we ever open our eyes to what other countries do and why they do it and how well it works? And we could be mining those ideas to refine our housing market, which you can listen to Ray Dalio and Warren Buffett and various other extraordinary commentators, and every now and again they mention, the housing boom, bubble in Australia. Oh, wait until that crashes. Just as a common little comment, that's what their summation is of our biggest asset class. Yes, Reverend Tim.
So I was interested in Commonwealth, Kingdom, Revolution. Back in the Curtin-Chifley government, the Labor housing minister said, we're going to stop the socialist communist revolution by turning every worker into a little capitalist. They said, we're going to massively subsidise home ownership. And largely, for the next 40 years, that policy worked. So we had incredible tax concessions for home ownership. Negative gearing, capital gains, all the rest has tilted it toward investment. I'm just interested listening to you, John. You sound a little socialist and revolutionary. Has there been, and I'm asking you to reflect on your time in politics, a loss of the end goal, which had bipartisan support? Because I think Menzies absolutely supported that too.
One of the interesting things is if somebody doesn't like your policy, they refer to you as a lefty or a righty. And socialist, I was told by Alex Hawke one morning when I was trying to get him to understand my housing policies, and he said to me outside his office was just opposite mine, he said, you're in the wrong party. And I looked at my watch, it was 11:15. I said, well, I think I can fix that by midday. And he didn't know how serious I was, because I was fed up with doing what I call, if you wanted to look at the word right, it can mean not left. It also can mean correct. And so I would like to think of right-wing policy as correct policy. And I'd say, well, this is actually good for people. And my recollection, Dad used to have a television rental business. We'd go and deliver television sets. He'd tell me to build up my forearms and I could be like Lou Hode. Lou Hode's dad was a milkman, and Lou lifted crates of milk and build up his forearms and anything to get me to help deliver sets. But he would talk to me at a very young age about the beauty of this country and how and the benefits of home ownership, and that Arthur Calwell and Bob used to have lunch every Friday after a sitting week, and they would sit and talk as two average blokes, and we've got some problems, and how do we address them, devoid of any politics. Bob had the idea that it would be a very good thing to increase home ownership. And Arthur insisted that the person on the minimum wage, and he was the champion of the minimum wage, had to go higher and higher and higher, that the person on the minimum wage should be able to afford a modest house. And they agreed and they worked together and they were great mates. And I had Bob's daughter, Heather Henderson, and Arthur's daughter, whose name I won't... Mary Elizabeth, come, because I'd formed a Caldwell Menzies club and we'd meet on Tuesdays and you had to leave politics out and we could talk about policy ideas and things like that. And it was a great group of my colleagues, and I probably had more friends on the other side than my side. But these two women came and talked about their father's love for each other, and they were interviewed by Michelle Grattan, who was, both of these girls, by the way, were in their 90s, and Michelle's deep into her 80s at the time. And it was the most glorious event where these two confirmed what great friends their fathers were, and all of the things that my dad had told me in the panel van delivering television sets. And so that's where my origins, and I don't like being told it's socialist, and if it is good, I'm a socialist then, but if you want to brand me, but it's just good, it's fair, it's Commonwealth, and who wouldn't vote for it? It's a vote winner. And how did Menzies hold the Prime Ministership for longer than anywhere else? Housing ownership went up every single term, and that was the foundation of how good Australia is going. And he gave great credit to Arthur, who was equally responsible for that golden era of Australia when the opposition wasn't just there to destroy, as it has been the currency in recent times, where it's like the battle of the biggest loser, and if you're not the biggest loser, you win, but you don't win anything because the day after the election, the battle just continues, and people can't get policies up, and there can't be bipartisan agreement, even on agreeing that our Indigenous people are the first people to come here. That is a national embarrassment, really is.
Craig Malcolm, JA, Chairman of the Far South Coast Community and United Unions.
Great to hear you. Great delivery. How long for you to identify these sites, so-called greenfields? Let's even try to the brown.
I'll tell you, they're already identified. It is so simple.
Timeline. Just because I moved to Chura Beach, and a mighty company like, not Quarry Bank, but their timeline was 20.
Yeah.
So we're now 20.
I'll answer that question. The greenfield sites are already identified. They should not be announced. One of the extraordinary events after Andrew McNaughton gave his evidence by saying you must identify the lands that will be impacted by the infrastructure and determine the current value of those lands, because 1 minute after you announce where the stations will go, it will be too late. And the next day, the 5 stations from St Mary's to the airport, Western Sydney Airport, were announced. And so there was no chance. But it's so easy to look at going from Sydney to Melbourne, that somewhere outside of the Southern Highlands hamlets of Berrima and Mossvale and Barrel, there is an open greenfield site with land that's of very low value, where you can establish a city that will grow to 1 million people within a few decades. And then outside of Goulburn, there's ideal sites. And somewhere servicing the Tri-City area of Canberra, Queanbeyan and Yass, another easy site to find and locate your high-speed train station and have a CBD, high-density housing, suburban areas, all planned with access from those existing townships. Oh, sorry, did I call Canberra a township? And it's easy to do. And that's the first thing you've got to do is identify those lands and determine their value on which you will make a charge. Because once you announce where the stations are going to be, it's too late. Very fundamental. So I know it was a long question. I know where you're coming from. I know where you got it, and that's the answer. Yes?
if you comment on the fact that the family home is not included in the asset test. How does that influence this debate and the policies and so
Well,
on?
that's the idea of using super to buy the family home. It then becomes an assessable asset. So what I'm saying is in one generation, we're going to move forward and have all of those homes bought with the aid of super accounted in the assessable asset class. Yeah, sorry, does that answer the question?
Well, not particularly. It was more the fact that, so many people, particularly getting retirement age, they put their funds in their home as an investment, but it's not really an investment, is it? It's not business, it's not stocks or whatever. So how does that affect the playing field of the home ownership and value of property and so forth?
That fact that somebody could have a $10 million home and still collect the age pension is what drove my policy work to make the home an assessable asset. It's just wrong that somebody with a $5, $10, $15, $20 million home can get the aged asset. The aged, the aged pension rather should go to those most in need, not those who don't need it. If somebody at $10 million house, they don't need the age pension.
Thanks. Thank you. In your presentation, you talked about your meeting with Malcolm Turnbull. I had to explain to him a few elementary things. Now, I recall turning on television one Sunday, and as Prime Minister, he spent some time, or a few minutes at least, explaining value capture to the media scrum. So, and he's actually the first Prime Minister I've actually heard the word.
Which Prime Minister was this?
Malcolm Turnbull.
Oh,
Turnbull.
yeah.
He talked about value capture, and that's the first time I heard the term from a Prime Minister's mouth. Now, my question to you is, was that rhetoric, or did he actually mean something, or did his track record suggest that he went to some lengths to implement, to go down that philosophy, or to fulfil that philosophy?
I had any number of really great meetings with Malcolm, and one of them was a pretty funny meeting in that he'd agreed to have me around to the lodge, just me, for dinner. And just as I'm leaving, he said, I'm just going to pop into the whip's office. And I'd just seen Tony Abbott go in there. And it's a very small office, and they gather and have drinks. And I'm thinking, oh, this is not going to be good for him. So I've gone to the lodge, and I'm sitting there waiting. And sometime later he comes. He's obviously had a couple of drinks. And then we went right through all of these value capture, settlement planning, tax ideas, negative gearing, the lever, everything that I had. Till 11 o'clock at night, we talked, he drank, and I tried to stay sober. I'm silly enough as I am. And he said, this is great stuff, John. This is great stuff. This is great. So I'm happy. I think I'll cut through. And the next morning I text him and say, what are we going to do? And he says, we're not going to do anything for the time being. And about a week later, he was rolled. And I thought, well, I often thought of Malcolm that he spent so long, desiring this position. By the time he got there, he forgot why he wanted it. And, he didn't, unfortunately, you always wish for the best of your prime ministers. Well, maybe not Scott Morrison. But so many people thought that he would make a great prime minister, and he didn't.
Thanks, John. I was just wondering, because you talked about settlements as a policy sort of vision, and I've heard that Ken Henry's also been very interested in this idea of developing new cities. What do you think is the biggest barrier in federal politics to actually having some leadership or some vision on the idea of settlement and planning new cities? Because we haven't really ever heard that talked about at all, as far as I'm aware.
That's right. I've never met Ken Henry, but we've spoken on the phone several times, and we have violent agreement. I like him a lot. We formed a group when COVID came in out of concern that there would be a housing crash, and Anna Bligh was on it, and a guy called Jeff Brunston and Anna Bligh. It's a good group. To define some policies, and we're kicking around these ideas, and we talked about these things. So, I often sort of see him talking about these things, and I think, oh, good, I've had some input there. I think he's really worthwhile, and his review and recommendations. I think I 100 or more recommendations, and 1 or 2 were taken up. So he didn't have much success with politics. And again, you go back to what Philip Lowe said. We need an independent body like a reserve bank to take charge of these important issues, to deliver them, and because the political system fails us. Whether you believe in nuclear energy is a good idea, once it's on the political battlefield, it's got no chance of getting up.
Thanks very much, John. What you said earlier about the potential of someone owning, let's say, a $10 or $15 million house and trotting down to, I was going to say the CES, but collecting their pension, I just thought it would be remarkable that someone could. It just seems like there's an undervaluing of the concept of fairness. Do you believe that there's been a change in the value of fairness? Like we used to talk about the fair go, and the way I sometimes look at Georgism as a fair share, a very straightforward idea, and I think it's it's robust as well. But it does seem like that it's changed over time, and that sort of sense of every man for themselves and the devil take the hindmost, which Kerry Packer line. But it sort of seems to be growing, and obviously that's troubling if you look at the idea of a prosperous, harmonious, and equitable society. So have you seen, you are a touch older than I am, have you seen a change in that attitude over the decades to fairness in Australia?
Unfortunately, I think I have. And I had a great young bloke working in our office, a guy called Daniel Severino. And, you take them into your office and you become friends. And one day we went to a school and he said, I attended the school, I'm on the honour board. I said, what are you on the honour board for, Daniel? He says, I was captain of the school. Very modest kid. But we worked together and we had a great atmosphere in our office. Everybody who came stayed, and it was because we got involved in policy development that we thought was good. Whether it was table tennis in schools to get kids of different ethnic backgrounds participating in a sport together, because we had a problem in that area that Chinese kids weren't playing football or cricket and being excluded from that social engagement. And we got table tennis tables put in all 40 schools. Hyundai sponsored it, and we had test matches and inter-school competition, and it was great. We had a thing called Bennelong Gardens for people with disability to garden commercially, and we tried forever to get that up, and it struggled. We had Shop Small, and we had our housing policy that everyone contributed to. And Daniel, at a sincere moment, said, every single policy you stand for has a basis of fairness. And it might have been quaint and old-fashioned, but I think that should be a fundamental. It was for so often. I mean, our attraction to sports is fair play, fair go. And it is, I think, often Americanism, to sort of rip people off and take more than what you need. And greed. Greed is good from that movie. And I don't think at the heart of what was best in Australia, that is us. That is, as Tony Abbott would say, that's not our best self. Our best self is caring for those who need a hand up. It is providing the opportunity. I mean, we've got this ridiculous situation. We did a lot of work on key worker housing and being able to provide even part ownership or a fixed rent that gave them all of the components of security of tenure, but even part ownership and be able to take that up, so that those who served our communities, whether they were nurses or school teachers or policemen or ambulance drivers or whatever, that they could actually live in the community that they serve. And wouldn't you love, if you lived in an apartment block, to know that there were school teachers and policemen and firemen and nurses living in your apartment block, and that somehow through our system we were assisting them to be able to live there even though their wages might not have been able to justify it. And it was things like that that bonded our office of some 10 people, and a lot of them were very young, They're all young compared to me, and I think that was a reawakening of what our fundamental and best self was. That it was built on that concept of fairness.
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that, but fairness would bond a community and greed would destroy it.
Yeah. Greed.
And then, ironically, community lifts land values as well.
Greed will end up with revolution. And you can see it in the US. I've got friends in the US. I was there just recently, and I've got a friend that lives in one of those gated communities in Palm Springs, and he was a war hero, terrifically decorated war hero. And I say to him every time I go there, the problem, Tom, is here. The have-nots have guns. And I can just imagine them rambling over your walls. You've got a private army. It's like, the old English lords. They had their private armies too. You've got these, they call it security. They've got guns like you can't believe. They've got these vehicles going around with all these guns. Are they waiting for that time when the gates are breached and the rabble come in to take, and have a revolution? You can see it happening. And in some ways, as Joe said earlier tonight, the army's been sent into Chicago, and they've been in Washington, they've been sent to Los Angeles, whether it's trumped up or whether it's real. But there does seem to be real problems in these cities, and there's extreme action being taken to suppress that problem. But really, it's bubbling along. The low wages, the division of wealth is just obscene in that. I used to love, if I saw a really lovely car going by, I loved the sight of a beautiful car. I'd say, every day you see a Rolls Royce, it's a better day. And when I was over there, I saw a Rolls Royce, I almost puked, because I thought, this rich person, and can't they see outside of their car and see the poor surroundings? How do you feel about that?
It's a degradation of the common humanity.
Yeah, yes.
And just to quote Plato, he said that when it gets desperate enough, desperation finds a leader, becomes a tyrant, and the cycle goes on again. So it's like push comes to shove eventually. Yeah, we'll find a way out.
And we've got to early diagnose this and take some prescriptive, preventive medicine now, while we can, not when things are absolutely desperate.
I don't have a very big voice, so let's see. Does this work? Can people hear me? Oh, hi, camera. Hi. Hi, thanks for that. That was so great. I'm just wondering, aside from the superannuation solution for housing, with over 1 million single-parent families in Australia now, and so much gig economy employment happening and so much underemployment, meaning that there's such a huge number of people who actually have less than $50,000 in superannuation when they retire. Can you see any other solutions on the cards, or a willingness to support people in that? For example, I'm 52, single mum of 3. I've been in the gig economy for 10 years. I've got 15 years window left to be able to get a mortgage. Otherwise, after this year, there will be no mortgages for me because I won't have it paid off in time. But I don't have savings either. So even though that mark of, or that measurement of well-being as a retiree is owning your own home when you're retired, I'm 52 and I know I'll never own one. So that's starting for me now. Can you see anything else in the horizon other than the superannuation solution for people like me, other single mums, or people who've been trapped in the gig economy for years and years and years? Are there any bubbling conversations for those people coming through, especially when developments are still after a profit above all else?
That's a rare woman that says their age. And it's a rarer woman that tells the truth about their age. And I just had a birthday, so I'm sort of getting used to my age. Wow. My oldest friend, Phil Dent, says you're living proof that only the good die young. But I have a similar greeting to him. Look, what you've just told me is an example of the failure of policies for the last 10, 20 or 30 years. And it's exactly the predicament that you find yourself that these suite of policies should address, which would include if when you were married, between you, your super was going into that property, that would then give you a division of that super. So you would have more in your super if this had been available to you. So it is a challenging situation that you find yourself. And it's magnified by the ridiculous cost of housing. Housing used to be somewhere between 3 to 5 years of average wages to buy the average house. In Sydney, it's 18 years. Now, that is, 3 and 18, 6 times. So something that's 3 million should only be 500,000 in reality, which would bring it into play. Whether with a resettlement plan to rebalance our settlement as opposed to the imbalance of settlement can provide an abundance of affordable housing in regional areas and they prosper, whether, I can promise you 52 is young. It's only when you're 74 do you realise how young you were at 52. So you've got a whole lifetime to go. And there's, with the right policies and with a supply of affordable housing, which will either happen through densification and various other mechanisms that could be in place. And why shouldn't your situation be identified as one of the situations? Because you're not the only one. It's a very common problem for women in certain age groups who've been married and they find themselves as single parents and working and trying to look after the children and do 5 things at once. That why shouldn't this cohort be addressed and be assisted in this? And if that wouldn't be a political winner, I don't know what wouldn't be. I mean, it's chivalrous, and it's fair and it's good, whether that can be done in time to assist you. But if you add your voice to the conversation and it gets identified and embroidered into future policy development, hopefully your situation gets addressed.
Otherwise, I'm moving him in Rainer.
Well, she talked to me earlier about moving in, actually.
Thank you, Raina.
Gee, you can't flirt like that anymore. Sorry, excuse me. I slipped, yes.
Hi, John. It was really lovely hearing you speak, especially as a university student myself at the moment. I thought it was very fascinating how you're talking about the importance of planning, and I actually wanted to ask you about the other side of things, because obviously we've got policy planning and economic planning, but when you said, no one brought up negative gearing at the last election, it shows that for Australians, like in our democracy at the moment, there's a real fear around bringing this stuff up, which would reflect that a lot of Australians either aren't aware of the true reasons behind our housing issues, or I suppose when we're talking about the side of people who have all of those investment properties and they have that $10 million house, they simply just don't care. So in terms of planning for the future, how can we bridge that gap? Because if we can't get Australians to care about these changes, you're right, no one's ever going to bring it up in the House of Reps or in the Senate. So what can we do in our conversations with the public to get them angry about this stuff and get them wanting these changes and then let it flow through?
I think to have a broader understanding of the impact of negative gearing, that it is so unjust, unfair, inequitable, that it takes from every renter and enriches the landlord. And it denies that renter the chance of actually buying their own property. Every year they rent, they get a year further away from ever buying. And it's very unfair. Do you rent?
Oh no, this is my dad.
Doesn't even pay board.
No, they're very gen. I'm only 19 at the moment, so no, I haven't been renting yet.
Well, we have so much in common. I was 19 once too. But that is the perfect place to be living with your dad,
It's
because he
great.
seems like a perfectly decent guy. You must have a wonderful mother.
I do.
Jokes. Yes, and it's good that you're engaged. My 3 children aren't engaged in politics and these discussions. You know, their eyes roll when I talk about these things. Although when the first one went to rent, she then tweaked and said, I think I understand what you're talking about, Dad. And then the younger one did buy a place and worked awfully hard and saved and scrimped and did everything right to buy a very modest apartment in Parramatta. Her 2, entitled elder siblings, but they don't have anything and she does. So she's doing awfully, awfully well. But it's you've got to get back to the common understanding and joining together to force the democratic process to change and raise this as an issue, because this negative gearing is so pervasive and so unfair and affecting this concentration of wealth amongst fewer and fewer and fewer. And in the end, if this goes unchecked, one person owns everything. That's what happens. That's the extreme. That's what happens in the absolute end.
I don't have a hook, but I've got
You've had enough. Yeah.
Would you please join me? Thank you, John, from Prosper and our members, and enjoy. Don't drink it on the way home.
Thank you all. Thank you, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That concludes the evening's formal program. Are we allowed to stick around for a little while and have drinks? Okay. Thank you very much for your presence and attention.